Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in this afternoon for our discussion, our office webinar this month on Is DEI Dead? We have some amazing panelists that will lead this discussion and definitely shed some light on the ever-changing lenses of what's happening in terms of DEI here across the country. Before getting started, we want to make sure that we strive to make our webinars interactive, so feel free to use the chat function to provide your comments, and we welcome questions throughout our webinar today. We have one of our colleagues at our office, Anishka, who will be moderating our questions in real time and chiming in as needed. Thank you in advance, Anishka. Again, we will answer as many questions at the end and afterwards as needed, as long as you provide your email address when you ask your question. And then please also note that this session is being recorded and will be available after our call today or after this webinar today, and it will be found on our events page at ouroffice.io/events. Last but not least, this webinar is approved for SHRM recertification credits, and we will be sharing that activity code at the end of the webinar. So we look forward to your participation, and we'll be showing that code again at the end of our webinar here today. And to get us started, I would love to have our panelists introduce ourselves. Unfortunately, Shonda won't be able to make our call today. She'll be greatly missed, and we look forward to having her be a part of a future Our Office webinar discussion. But I would like to turn it over to our panelists to introduce themselves, share a little bit more about who they are and how they are connected to this amazing DEI work that they do. Either of you can kick it off.
All right, I'll jump right in then. All right, well, hi everyone. I'm Ngozi Oke. I'm currently Global Head of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Nextrol. Nextrol is a marketing tech company, and I'm also editor of practicalesg.com, where I provide lots of DEI content for organizations and practitioners. And so you can check that out as well, practicalesg.com. And a little bit about me, actually. So before sort of entering into these roles, doing DEI work, I've actually had a a history of doing DEI work, but not explicitly DEI. I kind of started this work. I'm someone that, I actually used to think it was a flaw. I am very drawn towards issues of justice, like when I encounter injustice, it like really fires me up. And this has always been the case. And of course, I used to think it was an issue, but now I'm realizing it's a strength. I have done work with the NAACP back in the day, and as well as Congresswoman Susan Davis back when I lived in San Diego, when I was working with minority-owned businesses and women-owned businesses, and just creating opportunities and access for those businesses. And then eventually, I sort of came to a realization of the work that I love to do. And I went to Georgetown University to get my master's in HR management with an emphasis in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so that really helped really organize all of the passion and the experience and all of the things that I was drawn to and experience that I was getting. And it really launched me into leading diversity, equity, and inclusion within the workplace. And I sort of started out in the mortgage banking industry, and many of you know that that's an industry that really needs this work, because the history of mortgage banking, really reveals a lot of the roots of the issues that we have when it comes to access and inequity. And so that was a really enlightening and helpful place to sort of begin this work, at least within the workplace. I am happy now to be supporting this work in the tech space, and also through editorial services.
Perfect. Thank you so much for sharing so much about you and your background. I feel like everybody has their own journey into becoming the leader, and especially doing the DEI work that we're doing. So thank you for sharing your insights. And our other panelists for today.
Hi, my name is Liana. I am the Director of DEI and Employee Experience at Axios. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm very glad to be here today. Thank you so much for inviting me. Axios is a media company, so we're very centered on driving news forward, breaking news, expert insights. We have 20 newsletters that are kind of span those expertise, and then we have 30 newsletters that are in local cities across the country. So my role in the company is a heavy emphasis on experience, which is why I'm so glad to be here today because a lot of a lot's been changing, right? Ever since 2020, and it feels like it's constantly moving forward, backward, and then where are we? And so my focus has always at Axios been on the experience end. So I think you could kind of sum up my role in on the DEI side, of course, ensuring that our employee life cycle is acknowledging DEI practices, embedding them in our culture and our values from start to finish. That starts with our application process and ends with our exit interviews and everything in between. And then also, as we kind of balance, like all companies, that remote and hybrid work environment, how are we still moving forward together? How are employees experiencing work and DEI within their teams day to day? I find that it's all very centered together. So, and everything is kind of intertwined. So, it's important work, it's great work, and I'm just very happy to be here. Thanks, Tiffany.
Yes, thank you to both of you for agreeing to join this discussion. And many of you touched on, both of you touched on kind of like the work of DEI and how it's been evolving. And we know that it was here long before 2020, but it became a buzzword in 2020 for many people. The spotlight was shed on diversity, equity, and inclusion in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, and many organizations coming forward to essentially either in the racial justice kind of social activist side of it, committing to kind of end inequities in certain ways and pledge money and donations. And some people say almost $200 billion worth of pledges and things were shared or confirmed from different organizations saying that their commitment is there for this work. But now we're starting to see tables shift a little bit here in 2024. And not saying people have totally given up on DEI efforts, but we're definitely seeing a calming and for some people, elimination of DEI programming or even organizations, departments being eliminated. We see the elimination of affirmative action in college admissions processes. We're seeing increase in well, I guess you could say reverse discrimination lawsuits. And then overall, this changing political climate, we just see a lot of people going silent on DEI efforts for some organizations. And then we do see some organizations saying, we're standing behind this. We know it's important to our employees. We know it's important to the employee experience. We are still committed to doing this work. But we find a lot of people who are going kind of ghost, for lack of terms, on DEI. So I would love to hear from you all and just kind of our initial question and thinking about how can organizations really truly ensure that DI initiatives are not just surface level efforts. We're hearing a lot from people saying, oh, well, they're just doing it to say they're doing it. How do you see it being kind of deeply ingrained in company culture and values? How can organizations make sure it doesn't look like an act, but something that they're really truly committed to doing? Either of you can take that one. I think you both have views on how organizations can really start doing that work.
Yeah, I can lend a few thoughts on this for sure, because this is something that we've all seen sort of the shakeout in this space as you've described, right? Where organizations were really enthusiastic about it, right? In 2020, right after the murder of George Floyd, everyone seemed to sort of wake up to it, pledge money, pledge, their commitment and whatever that looks like. And we've seen a huge decline in a lot of that, right? And I do think that largely the decline, not all of it, largely the decline actually to me is really sets apart the organizations who have done this work and are doing it well, right? And are doing it not performatively, and the ones that are doing it surface level, performatively, superficially. Those things don't last, right? They just hopped on a trend, and it wasn't really something that really permeated throughout their employee life cycle. It wasn't something that they really had intentional conversation about, that they were really invested in. And so what I've seen is the organizations that have stuck to it, there's a few things that stand out about them. And one is that a lot of them have had this have started at least the conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion beyond 2020. They didn't just wake up to it and just hop on a trend. They were already having these conversations. And so that's really meaningful, because that means that they're wrestling, diversity, equity, and inclusion is not really, it's not, as we're finding out, it's not like as simple, right? As we'd like it to be. Everyone doesn't just hop on the bandwagon. There are some real questions to wrestle with. And so it's important that companies that are doing this work meaningfully are prepared to face those questions and ask themselves, what does diversity mean for us, right? What are the gaps that we have? Right? What does equity and inequity mean for us as an organization? What does inclusion mean for us? Who is excluded? Right? And to really get the answer to those questions, you have to look at the data, right? You have to really dig into the history of your organization, of your industry, to really answer those questions. And so it takes a level of individual and corporate investment that is beyond just pledging dollars, that's in, beyond like a superficial, like a heightened level of like, emotion and jumping on a trend. It's not that fleeting. You really have to wrestle with different things and answer questions and say to yourself, okay, if we're saying that we are an organization that, that cares about all of our employees and all of our consumers, what does that actually mean? That means we don't just slap the word all on there and think that we've done a job. What that means is that we are committed to actually understanding what the gaps, what gaps exist, right? Like, which groups of our consumers are we not reaching? Who in our workforce are we not accessing? Right. And so we're not running away from, what is now termed as like exclusive language, which is a lot of the language that we're seeing now. That's where we're seeing anti-DEI legislation. It's sort of using the language of DEI to, sort of like weaponized against DEI, right? It's like, well, it's exclusive. Well, in order to get to a place where we're saying all, and we're saying that we, are, providing access to everybody, and we are a workplace that does this and does that for all people, you have to know who is currently missing from that equation, right? And so that requires a level of, sort of targeted conversation and specificity and data and detail that often folks are uncomfortable with. And so what I found is that organizations that take this work seriously are committed to having those conversations, to pulling up that data, to really facing that history, and to, stick with it, stick with that discomfort and ride it out and get through to a place of clarity of like, okay, we understand where our gaps are, what we need, and where we're planting our flag and why. That comes from really extensive and intentional conversation. So I found that that's very helpful. And actually, I tell practitioners that, I know we all want a job someplace, right? But before you agree to work for an organization, make sure that they are committed to doing that work. Make sure that executive leaders, that senior managers are committed to doing that work, or else, you tend to be the only one that ends up really caring about it, right? And one person can't carry this job, this work for an entire organization. So you have to have major stakeholders doing the work within the organization, and understanding why, because then when critics do, come up, you're able to help them understand, like, here's why we're doing this. We've done the research. We know the data. Here it is. get on board, or maybe this is not the place for you, right? And so there's a level of confidence too that comes from doing that work, that the stakeholders are now able to defend the work in a very meaningful way, right? And so and I'll just put one more out there, and another piece of it that I think is really important is a partnership with your legal team, which sometimes feels
Yeah.
scary. It's
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
should I be partnering with the legal team on this, or are they going to tell me not to do this, not to do that because it's risky? But here's the thing: is when I talk about stakeholders, internal stakeholders, legal team is a part of that, right? Because the legal team, like I'm not going to pretend that as a practitioner I know all the things, right? Your executive team doesn't know all the things. That's why you have general counsel. That's why you have internal or external legal counsel to support your work every step of the way. And the thing is that this individual or this group, they do it for all of the other organizational practices, right? They're making sure that as an organization, you're doing things in lockstep with legal compliance, right? You don't want to get in trouble that way. And so it's the same concept, right? As you're building your diversity, equity, and inclusion goals and strategy, it's really important to work with the legal team, not so that they can, throw it all away. Actually, a really good partnership should look like a two-way conversation where you're telling the legal team, here are the gaps that we're seeing. Here's why we want to do this. Here's, how we're going to set our goals. What's the best way to do that? Help us so that we can set this up for success. And so that way they can look through it and say, oh, okay, yeah, this is what we can do. Here are sort of, some of the legal risks of this. Here's how we want to tweak that language, right? Because a lot of it is legalese. A lot of it is really about language. Here's how we want to tweak that language so we make sure that we're not, using language that makes us susceptible to, incompliance, right? And then this partnership one helps to increase your confidence as a practitioner, but also the confidence of the stakeholders to know that, okay, we've got legal on board. And so we know that everything that we're doing is legal. And also it prepares the legal team to now be, to now sort of be prepared to receive any kind of like criticism or anything like that, right? They're on board with you. They know exactly what you're doing. They know what your goals are. They know what the language looks like, so that as the legislative landscape changes, right, they are in tune with that, and they know when we need to continue to shift the language if necessary to continue to protect the work that needs to be done, right? They know, if someone comes to them and says, oh, I'm gonna like sue everybody for X, Y, and Z. They've already prepared for that. That's the legal team. It's what they do. You know what I mean? And so I think that there's a lot we can talk about in terms of like the companies that really set themselves apart. I'd say that groundwork, those intentional conversations, really, really big, but also that partnership with stakeholders, including the legal team, is very, very key.
Yeah, 100%. And I think you brought up so much in this that we know from being DEI practitioners, even saying when you start going to different organizations, and are people truly bought into this concept of DEI? Or is it truly just a fad of saying, hey, come on over, we just want somebody in this role to say we have them. And a lot of people are experiencing extreme burnout and just overall frustration about that. And we'll talk more about that further on in our discussion. But we know that that is happening, where people are in organizations that aren't necessarily supportive of the work internally. Even though externally they're putting on this facade of like, hey, we're doing this, everyone belongs here. But we're finding internally culture is not that great. And one thing that I would love to get Liana's part on this too is we talk so much about employee experience and really understanding the lived experiences of your employees. Some of the work we do here at our office is really supporting our customers in doing an employee survey and like getting insights. You'd be very surprised on how many people are like, oh yeah, we haven't had an employee survey. We don't know. But people are also in some ways afraid of data, right? Because you're afraid of what your employees may say. And when you ask them, you have to do something about it, right? Liana, I would love to hear from your perspective around employee experience and those synergies with DEI and really truly making sure that we are supporting employees from the beginning, from the onboarding to even when they exit the organization, but really creating, I think what we say in the DEI space is really the sense of belonging. How do we make sure that each employee really has that connection? And we know that that's important for people to have a connection to work, but we know DEI is in the layers of all of that as well. So we'd love to hear kind of from your lived experience in your organization and things you may have seen previously about kind of that connection with employee experience in DEI.
Yeah, well, when you say that sometimes like leadership and companies is afraid to see and read the data and know it, a lot of times employees are afraid to share it, right? Because there's power structures or hierarchy that is not a feeling of belonging and safety, or they witness someone else speak out and that wasn't a good reaction from leadership. And so everything, that is backed in fear just breaks down communication lines so fast. And so when I started here at Axios, we're about 500 employees now. We were about 250 when I started. And the very first thing I did was essentially do a listening tour and talked to some of our most engaged employees, some people who were like new and were very like brand new, kind of in that honeymoon phase of a job, people who've been here for a year or two, and then like OGs, people who had been here a long time. And so it was such valuable information for me to kind of hear different perspectives, different experiences on different teams, and kind of just listen mostly, but also ask follow-up questions of like, to understand the culture. And I can't emphasize enough, like knowing your audience. I think that the thought of like company self-awareness is also super important to pair with that. But if you know your audience, if you know kind of what makes them feel safe at work or what really doesn't, like that is such powerful information to know as teams kind of roll out communications, policies, procedures. And everyone kind of absorbs information in different ways, I've learned here. And it usually takes multiple times to tell someone something before it's like really resonating. So I think just being very aware of that. Like there are some people who I know I couldn't get an email response from, but I know if I just sent them a Slack, like I'd get it right away. So I can't emphasize enough just that self-awareness and knowing your audience. And two, as well, it can't just fall on one person. I don't think we can say this enough, right? As practitioners, it can't just be the responsibility of one person or one team. A lot of influence can come from executive teams and co-founders and things, C-suite, but it really does have to kind of resonate throughout the entire staff and especially managers. I think a lot of times too, like in this remote and hybrid world, the most face time you have is with the people that you work in and day out. And maybe you go into the office once or twice a day, and then people have alternating days. And it's really kind of hard to get that connection and trust with people when it's just a different working world now. So I think that is one thing we identified really quickly when I started. And we part of our orientation is a whole training on trust. And it's not like, oh, let's sit around and hold hands and like talk about how we trust one another and do whatever. It's really breaking down and having those hard conversations about, sometimes or some people are coming into this organization with really shattered experiences around trust at work, whether they had a really toxic experience at their last company due to X, Y, and Z, or they're just feeling really lost. I mean, everyone's going to come in different places. And so it's really, really important to kind of align on what does trust look like here at Axios? What does safety look like here? What does belonging look like? And if we can kind of level set and say, we don't expect you to get here in the next 7 days or whatever, 30 days. But if we're working towards the same goal, I think that tries to help level out things. It tries to kind of open those lines of communication for folks.
100%. Thank you. Thank you for sharing those points. But we know overall the work cannot be done with one person. Managers are so critical And people don't leave their jobs, they leave bad managers. And your managers really truly lead the culture. They are the person who's implementing what culture looks like, because that is how employees are experiencing their work day in and day out. So I think that is a key nugget that people need to recognize with the work as well. That there is the CEO saying we believe in DEI, but then there's a manager that could be like, I don't believe in this mess. They're just saying whatever. And that will really truly impact how someone receives any DEI message from the organization moving forward, right? Because the leader most close to you has basically said they don't believe in it. They're not with it. They don't care anything about it. When we have a question in the chat around, do you all see there's particular industries that have a more natural DEI focus just due to the industry or the work that they do versus others that where DEI may not be seen as critical? Would love to hear your insights on that. I know for me, top of mind, we see a lot of people committed to doing the work who are working in the nonprofit space, people who are working and servicing communities of diverse populations. That those are often people who are in that nonprofit space, and committed to making sure they are building inclusive spaces, and building teams that are diverse to be able to serve their clientele. But that's just me off top of mind. Would love to hear from either of you, and your opinions around industries that you see as more of a have natural DEI focus than others.
So, I've got experience working in the mortgage banking space, and that's a space that really needs this work for the reasons that I mentioned. And I just want to be honest with you all. I struggled a bit in that industry because I found that it was really resistant to change. And so it's really difficult for one person to do this work when the culture is resistant to change, right? And so, part of the reason, just having a real honest conversation, part of the reason that I did transition, right, from mortgage banking into a tech space is, just because after, doing some research and, connecting with my network, I, realized that I wanted to, I didn't really want to, like, this work can be challenging enough. I didn't want it to feel like I was, shoving it down people's throats. Didn't want to do that. That's not good. And so I wanted to transition into an industry that, without like sort of taking away the DEI language and jargon, it's a space that really welcomes change, that thrives on innovation, right? That loves to learn, that is not afraid to evolve. And so that really, the tech space sort of jumped out to me as an industry that really embodied a lot of these values that I was looking for. And since transitioning into that space, I will tell you that there is no perfect industry, no perfect company, okay, but it is an industry that I do think is receiving this work a little bit better, just because of those culture, that culture and those values of innovation and being okay with change and just wanting to do whatever is necessary to create the best workplace that's going to drive the most innovation, right? And so that is just based on my experience, what I found.
Yeah, Leanna, what do you think from any other additional thoughts on that in terms of like industries that you see that have more natural DEI focus?
I feel like education, whether it's, early education in preschools and public schools, all the way through higher education. Um, I remember just I went to CU Boulder and I went to UMass Amherst, two very liberal schools. And it was, it was definitely, I'm from Massachusetts. So going to Colorado and experiencing like a completely different kind of world than I had been used to in Massachusetts and I remember very, very strongly like feeling that, hearing that kind of the diversity and everything and how different thought and lived experiences were so prevalent. And then in my career, I had been in the nonprofit world. So I agree with you, Tiffany. And I had also been in fashion, which is not known for its diversity emphasis. And I still think there is a lot to a long way to go in the fashion industry for sure. But I didn't work in fashion after 2020. So I know since then I've seen a lot more like at least outwardly facing commitment. I think Aurora James is doing a lot with her 15% pledge and really amplifying DEI in the fashion industry specifically. But
Yeah, it's a lot of industries that externally sometimes they have to respond. They have to show that they have these DEI efforts because it's what their consumer is kind of starting to ask for now. So they are changing that. But then there's some kind of organizations that may be more in the background. You don't know what the work that is that they do. They don't have a direct consumer all the time. So maybe they don't have to really amplify their DEI messages or commitment in the same way. We had a question in the chat about this, and this was a question I had already planned to discuss with the group. How do we redirect naysayers? These people who maybe, I don't want to call it non-believers of DEI, but um, how do you kind of make sure you include all demographics? There's been a lot of conversation about white men feeling excluded in this work and feeling like their voice isn't amplified, and they feel excluded from the DEI work as well. So I would love to hear from you two things. How do diverse populations of when people think DI, they think, oh, it's only for race and gender, but there's so many elements of diversity I think we often forget. And there are some populations that feel alienated in the work and they often don't feel included. How do we make sure they feel a part of the fold in some way? And then how do you redirect people who are naysayers and thinking that DEI is not important or it has no impact on organizations overall? Who would like to start this one?
I feel like I've been starting a lot of them. Liana, you want to start?
sure, yeah. Oh, naysayers and haters of DEI really just get under my skin in a way that we don't have time for. But I'm not living in a fantasy world. I know it's out there. Um, I would say that, I mean, it kind of depends. I'll give you an example though. In Axios, we are a company that is extremely diverse. I know that because I have the data. It's not just what we can see on the screen. We run demographic and inclusion surveys. I think any time that you kind of go into a conversation with someone who's like a naysayer, if you can back up your conversation with data, that is just like irrefutable in a lot of ways. So there are a lot of products out there that will kind of help you run a demographic and inclusion survey. I also think like identifying in your company who has influence, right? Who has power and influence, because they're different. Sometimes they're the same, sometimes they're different. And our company is founded by two white men who are two of the biggest champions that I've met in business around DEI. It's been that way since the first conversation I had with them 3 years ago and coming on. And so not only do they have power, they're co-founders and the CEO, but they also have influence. And then from there, able to identify like who else on the staff like is going to be an ally in this work. Who like I think there's a lot of like allies out there, but like an active ally, right? Who's really going to, step up and be a co-lead for our allies group, who's going to, help post content and get out the word and get speakers for us to continue doing staff education things. And then I just want to touch on something that we talked about earlier is, having that skill of having hard conversations. This work, I think everyone on the call knows, like one of the best skills I think you can have is the ability to have difficult conversations, have effective and productive, difficult conversations, because it's so easy and natural to get wrapped up in the emotion of a naysayer and kind of like what they're saying and things, but I think when you're backed by data and the skill, like it is a skill of having like difficult conversations like that, it does help.
Yeah, I second all of that, Liana. And I would like to add that, there is a portion of it that is around having difficult conversations, as Liana just, wonderfully explained. There's a portion of it that is around sort of like, education and helping folks understand that, what this work includes. Yes, we often tend to start because we also need to have I think a little bit more honest conversation in this work, right? Yes, often we start with race and ethnicity because we have a lot of data and we have the history that shows us that that is an area of need, right? We still have, pay, compensation gaps and all of that. Like there's real tangible stuff that we can share to show this is a really good place to begin. But then also we do need training to help folks understand that it's not just race and gender, right? It's, sexual orientation, it's, ability, disability, it's, veteran status. It's, there's a lot more, right, that we're looking at. And so I think making sure that we spotlight and, create opportunities for education around these other identities, it's in some of the challenges and triumphs and all of that around those other identities, very, very important. I will also say that sometimes with critics and with naysayers and with DEI haters, sometimes the best way to go is two things: to not address them, honestly, because sometimes the most exhausting thing that you can do as a practitioner or even as an organization is to spend your time addressing and paying attention and consuming all of that content and addressing somebody who may not even be open to growing in that direction, or just may be committed to never aligning in their values or in their commitment. So there's really nothing you can say to educate that person or to buy them in, or to get their buy-in or to win them over. So you do have to also be have some discernment around like where you're going to channel your energy. And if, whether this person after, an attempt or two is really willing to understand, right? And how much time you want to give to that, because it can be exhausting. It can really wear you down. And sometimes that itself is the intent. And we don't want that to win, right? And then also there's a piece of it too that's like, well, you're not if we're doing this in a workplace or within an organization, we're not necessarily an individual trying to convince another individual about what to do. No. This is an organizational initiative, and this is aligned with the values of the organization, because that's one of the things that we need to make sure we do as practitioners or as organizations is like, it's not DEI in a corner and a thing that we just do here and there. It should actually be brought into alignment with organizational values and with organizational culture. Right. So that when someone says that, oh, they don't believe in this, it's like, oh, what do you mean you don't believe in it? Are you saying that you don't believe in treating people well? Are you saying that you don't believe in equitable, policies and practices? Are you saying that you don't like, what is it that you're saying that you don't believe in? Because as an organization, we've planted our flag and we're saying that this is our commitment. These are our values. This is our culture. And if you don't want to learn about that and kind of get on board with it, maybe this is not the place for you. There are lots of companies out there. Maybe this is not the place, right? And sometimes it can be hard, right, to really say that and to face that, but that is a reality, and that needs to remain an option, because sometimes that's the truth, right? Some folks, if they are really having a hard time aligning, maybe it's not the right place for them. And I think that we need to get better about being okay with that.
100%. I think we have some questions also in the chat that kind of surround this as well of we know we can't always win over everybody, 100% of people. My goal is always in like change behavior. We want that, but we know those things also take time. So people aren't going to wake up and just like, oh, I want to learn about other people now. There is a lot of people who live in a lot of silos, and they may not have any idea the lived experience of any diverse coworker and just totally oblivious to some of the things that they may experience from day to day, whether that's a microaggression or just discrimination overall. Some people never experience that in their life. And then there's some people who are like, I experience that every day. So we're trying to share with people the lived experiences of others to hopefully have some empathy, to hopefully change, behavior. We know it's not something that's going to happen overnight. And one of our attendees asked in our chat here is, do we think one of the reasons people have turned away from DEI is that it was taken too far, and now it is a backlash? There are some people who feel like from 2020 to now, people have just kind of run with put every person of color, every woman in a leadership position. Some people's ideas are that they didn't deserve this experience or deserve this opportunity. They're getting it because of DEI efforts. Somebody even said last month around the Baltimore issues with the ship and the crashing there at the port in Baltimore. Oh, that's the DEI mayor. Look at what you get with the DEI mayor. People are using these things, words in a kind of role, and there's a lot of backlash from people. People are saying it's been taken too far, but what do you think are some of the reasons behind people saying that? We know different things in the media play out different ways, and politics have a lot to do with it. But what are some of your kind of personal thoughts around reasons why people may have turned away from DEI?
Such a loaded question and a good question. I think, I mean, to circle back to where we started, it's the fear. I mean, I think a lot of the hesitancy and now the overt rejection and repeal and everything is, I try to understand it. This is what I do when I'm out walking the dog or something. Like when I read the news and we see it day after day after day, another state is kind of rolling back the requirement of having DEI in public universities and colleges. Texas was the first. I think there was an article about North Carolina doing it. It kind of feels like constantly like it's like a drip, 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 and like it's all accumulating into kind of just mass like chaos about like where are we, and hence the title of this webinar, like, is DEI dead? Like, I think that again, like when you align the work to the values of the company, when you making them front and center and they're embedded in different ways by multiple people, it strengthens it. It goes back to the foundation of that. I want to give some, I want to hear Ugo's thoughts.
Yeah, well, I I work in a world where I actually like to be a little bit more explicit and clear about what diversity means, what equity means, what inclusion means. And so I think that part of the issues that we run into sometimes with DEI is that, people who don't have a detailed understanding of what we're talking about, they are able to just couple it all, package it all, and then throw it away or blame everything on DEI. And it's like, well, what are you talking about? And so the first thing is that, I think that's, the question around, what was DEI taken too far, I think is really difficult to answer, because I would need more, a better understanding on what that question means. Like, what do you mean, has DEI been taken too far? Because we still have data that shows us that, we have marginalized groups and groups that are largely underrepresented in some industries, underrepresented, in organizations. We have a recent report that really just goes to affirm a lot of lived experience that says just by someone's name and the racial perception of their name, they are less likely to be called for an interview, and this is, and so we have a lot of the data. We got the pay gap. Like, we have a lot of the data that actually tells us that we haven't gone far enough, that we haven't done enough. And so the question is, what, what do we mean when we're asking, if DEI has gone too far, right? Are we just kind of coupling it all without, really like understanding what it is we're asking and just throwing it away? Like, what do we mean so that we can actually address that question in a way that's helpful for everyone, that's meaningful for us? And so that would be my response to that is, usually when there's things that, like a lot of the anti-DEI legislation just says DEI, and it's like DEI is exclusive, it excludes people. It's like, wait, that is we're not even working with the correct definition of DEI to begin with, right? And yet we have whole laws that are built on erroneous definitions of DEI. And so I try not to, to continue to perpetuate that if possible. So I would encourage, even in questions to us for us to impact that a little bit more.
Yeah, 100%. And I think one of the participants, Cassandra, also said, how can we say something's been taken too far when there still isn't actually equity in the workplace? So there's constant reports coming out about the lack of people of color in leadership positions. There's constant conversations that we're having daily when you start looking at the data within your organizations, from a admin level all the way up to executive level. We see that the closer we get up to the top, the lack of diversity we have. And that's in a lot of organizations across a lot of different industries, across a lot of different states. So we know that the gaps exist in pay equity. You touched on that as well. And we know those gaps are still rolling. And for some people, the gap is even widening. So a lot of this work, people, I don't know what the assumption was about, taken too far, but I do think that there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. And we start thinking about the allies in our organizations. Sometimes DEI is coupled within HR, and sometimes it is not. So I would love to hear from either of you around like what role you feel like HR departments play in advancing DEI efforts within organizations, and how can they ensure that these efforts are sustainable and effective? We know our HR teams are often overwhelmed and short-staffed in many ways. Liana, I see you come off mute. I would love to hear from you about kind of what role you feel like HR departments play in advancing these DEI efforts.
Oh my God, how much time do we have? I think for the number one thing that jumps out at me is at the advocacy piece. HR looks different in every company, but almost all of them have the same kind of elements. Talent acquisition, so bringing in the talent management, helping the talent once they're there, managing through, interpersonal issues or things like that, performance reviews, huge around. We could have a whole conversation just on equity and performance reviews. And employee experience like myself, and then people operations, compliance, the law, the benefits, the rewards. They all touch every aspect. And so making sure that not only is your chief people officer, your head of people, an advocate, an ally, someone who's very active and confident in their voice, but ensuring that they have teams around them that are open to that learning if they aren't already bringing it in, that have just a natural curiosity on like continuing to keep up with like what's changing in the trends. And then they're the holders of the data, right? A lot of that data, whether it's like performance reviews, literal scores that managers are giving employees, or qualitative feedback that they're giving, they have all of that, and it can be, analyzed and everything. And right now it's kind of hard, but with the emergence of AI, like it's only going to get easier to kind of sum up where are specific teams having different struggles. What else? They're just so core to that. And I think also to the head of HR, or whoever's like kind of the top, the chief people officer, reporting directly to the CEO, having that direct line of communication so that there is like an emphasis on ensuring that the top leadership is aligned on what we're doing with DEI. And I think too, making internal commitments. So a lot of what we do at Axios is we'll have a recruiting commitment around what are an outline for the staff. Where exactly are we going to get super granular with our recruiting commitments when it comes to DEI? Are we having diverse slates of candidates come through? Yes. Are we committed to ensuring the panels who are interviewing them are doing so in a trained and equitable way? And that we're trying to mitigate bias as much as possible? Yes. Are we having our ERG leaders involved in some of the top positions that we're hiring for? Those are all things that we do at Axios. And I think it's in partnership with our ERG leads that we were able to kind of come together, hear from them as representatives of their communities on what matters to them and what they want to see, and also how we can put it into a legit process here.
Yeah, and I can add just a little bit to that, because I do think that Liana just explained the really important role of HR in throughout the employee life cycle, right? And that's why that partnership is so important with DEI and HR teams, is because it's important to embed DEI throughout the employee life cycle. And HR largely manages a lot of that, and so that partnership then is very important. And the chief HR officer having the direct line to the CEO is very important. So you really want to get connected to that top line relationship, but also throughout the employee life cycle. I will say too that I've seen some HR teams not really be well positioned, and so then if DEI reports into an HR team that is not really valued in the organization, that's not a strategic partner in the organization, then that is stigmatized. Nobody trusts HR. DEI will then suffer, right? It sort of similar, the same fate. And so I do think it's important to make sure that like the HR team and the HR function is really valued, and is, their role is really understood in the organization for that collaboration between DEI and HR to really be as powerful as it could be.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because I spent most of my career not in HR and being like, ugh, HR, like everyone, I think everyone maybe has had that experience at some point, like, oh, like I know. And so when I came into Axios, I was very upfront with the fact that I had never had an HR role before. And that is an asset, because I know what the employees might be thinking, because I used to think that. And it was really important to me to do the hard work it is to ensure that we are like a very healthy experience for our employees, like that they're not being like, oh, HR. Like the people team has done a lot of work over the years to ensure that as best possible, we can be seen as a resource and helpful, and not like, ugh.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I feel like that is often a stigma, and which is why many people, even some customers that we work with, are like, we want to be separate from HR, so it doesn't look like we are a part of something that maybe necessarily has a bad rep, right? And there are some reputations that you can't improve instantly over time. For some organizations, it isn't always valued. And the office isn't always valued, and the department isn't always held in high regard. So that is something that a lot of people struggle with. We did have a question in the chat around it, and I didn't really touch on this question earlier, around rebranding your DEI efforts, right? There are some people who are removing the diversity part. We had a participant in our chat kind of say they feel like people are tired of hearing the word diversity, and it's kind of become divisive for some people. We've seen that there are some people saying they're rebranding their DEI efforts and not calling it DEI anymore. It's just calling and maybe it is just employee experience and not DEI at all. Maybe some people have added justice to the DEI lens. I would love to hear from you around your thoughts and around rebranding efforts, eliminating parts, whether diversity or equity, and kind of what does that mean? Does that mean that you're watering down your efforts? Does it mean that you're still committed to the work if you want to rebrand or take a word away? How do you see that from your lens? And Gezi, do you want to start that one off?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am okay with rebranding DEI. I am well aware that the name of this work and even the work itself has shifted throughout the years, right? Since, I mean, with the origin in the 1960s, with it being really centered initially around the civil rights movement, it's really transitioned over the years. The name of it has transitioned, the work around it even has transitioned a bit over the years. And so that to me is something that I have felt has been inevitable anyway, right? Like, and so I'm open to changing it, to changing the name in a way that can help folks, really better understand it or get behind it. I, I am still an advocate for the way that the work is currently done in a sense. I mean, I do think that really the emphasis on diversity, even if we don't call it diversity, it's really helpful to understand who is marginalized, who is historically underrepresented, who are what are the communities, who are the people, and being able to explicitly say that and to find the data and to understand the history behind it, I think is really helpful for informing the rest of the work, right? It's hard to know what we're talking about if we don't know who is excluded and what communities we're talking about and the history to research and the data that we're looking at. And so we don't have to call it diversity, but I do believe that whether we call it social impact, environmental, social governance, ESG, right? Like, whatever we call it, I do think that it's still important to have an eye on the communities that we're talking about and to be able to be clear about those communities and why, there's, maybe work targeted around those communities. Just so that it's the work is not watered down to be meaningless, right?
Yeah.
Just a quick note, because you mentioned
Uh-huh.
justice, and I have seen, that I have seen organizations that are like tacking on a J or, just expanding the acronyms. And I would say that, those acronyms should be meaningful. And so I always employ organizations, if you're going to add an acronym, know what you're talking about. Because if you go from diversity, equity, and inclusion to diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, you're actually saying something much stronger about what it is that you are planning to do. So make sure you understand what it is that you're adding on and that you mean it.
Yeah.
But before you go there. Yeah.
100%. Liana, what are your thoughts around the DEI? Do we move words around? Do we eliminate using the term altogether? How does that kind of affect whether or not you're staying committed to the work?
I too am okay with a rebrand. I think that two things come to mind. The first was like one of my earliest mentors and work is like at work was she would always say, when if I was struggling with like a coworker or something because like I felt like we weren't getting treated the same way. I felt like I was working so much harder, whatever. She would always say like good work's always going to stand out and last. Good work's always going to shine through. I mean, there just might be some storms to weather, but like at the end of the day, we're going to recognize strong, good work. So that comes to mind, but also to, um, reassessing kind of where you are. I don't think it's a bad thing to have a plan set out for your DEI strategy, your DEI initiatives, all of that, and then have a plan. But then when you kind of, that's just life, right? As the world's constantly changing and everything, to reassess even on like a quarterly basis, like, okay, this is what we had set out and intended to do, but this is like kind of the reality of like how we're able to kind of like balance or integrate something in. And reassessing and then moving forward is I think not a sign of weakness, but more so just a willingness to understand that some things are beyond your control or change, whether it's internal within the company or external, and you just keep going.
100%. I am going to go ahead and share my screen so we can talk about our share the activity code. But I also want to close out giving each of you a kind of an opportunity to think about we talked about this a little bit earlier, in kind of riding the wave of all of this. And we know, being a DI director, folks are experiencing so much burnout. Would love to hear your tips for self-care for DEI professionals and just riding out this current trend. So 30 seconds. Liana, you can start.
I have found that there is power in community. No one quite understands what it's like to be a DEI practitioner than another DEI practitioner. I've found a lot of really good community in Safe Space. It's kind of mostly geared towards HR. However, there are so many great conversations about DEI in it, and it's kind of an online community from Work Week. So if you Google Safe Space and then Work Week, it should pop up.
Okay.
And then I just think staying really taking care of yourself, number two, for sure, and not losing your voice. I think it's so easy to kind of go through the ups and downs of everything and start to doubt yourself. And that's really, if you let the self-doubt kind of creep in too much, it gets harder. So trust yourself, make sure you're good with yourself, you're understanding that, and take care of yourself.
All right. And Gessie, what would you share in terms of self-care and
Yeah.
protection of all of that for our DEI professionals?
Yeah, I'd say, draw strength where you can. So whether that be the community, that you've got, and sometimes it can be just a community of your girlfriends outside of DEI. Just say, listen, I don't want to talk about work. Let's grab a cocktail and just kiki, whatever that looks like. I've got toddlers, so whenever they come home, that I draw a lot of strength from them. Just, the playfulness and the fact that they're just so innocent and all they want to do is like play and talk to mommy, and that lets me forget about some of the challenges of being a DEI practitioner. Also, if if your faith is important to you, draw strength from that, draw meaning from that, right? If exercise is valuable to you and maybe you find that you're slipping on that, your mental health is struggling, prioritize that, right? If you're currently in a workplace that is toxic to you, leave that workplace, because it can be a matter of life or death. And this is talking from somebody who experienced that. Okay. So do whatever you need to do to like feed yourself, to stay okay, to manage even your consumption of anti-DEI content. There's a lot of it coming out right now. And so if you find that every day you're, reading 10 articles about how DEI is dead and da da da, pause those things, right? Manage the consumption of all of that stuff, and do what you need to do for your own mental health and for your own well-being.
Yes. Thank you so much to our amazing panelists. Thank you for sharing your insights today. And thank you to each of you who've joined us. Again, this recording will be shared on our events page. And thank you so much for joining us. And we look forward to our next webinar. Thank you so much to our panelists. And everyone have a great rest of the day.